This is a podcast by the Straits Times.
Hello, I'm Ravi Velloor, and this is an Asian Insider podcast. In this episode, I focus on a Chinese view of what is unfolding in the United States since Mr. Donald Trump was installed as president. For government leaders around the world, as well as analysts and journalists, this has been a most interesting 6 weeks, as Mr. Trump reverses so much of what has gone on before him, whether in domestic policy or in foreign affairs. From an East Asian viewpoint, there are very few people better qualified to comment on these matters than my friend Wang Xiangwei, the eminent China watcher. Xiangwei is a former editor-in-chief of the South China Morning Post, and he currently teaches journalism at Hongkong Baptist University. Welcome to Asian Insider, Xiangwei.
Thank you, Ravi. Thank you for having me.
Xiangwei, what do you make of the early weeks of the Trump administration? And perhaps we could start with the attacks on big government and then move on to talking about the shifts in foreign policy and so forth.
Okay, thank you. As a keen student of Chinese history, I cannot help but see parallels with China's Cultural Revolution regarding what U.S. President Donald Trump and his billionaire ally Elon Musk did as they waging a war against the U.S. federal bureaucracy. You know, why I'm saying this is because nearly 60 years ago, Mao Zedong, China's first generation leader, launched the Cultural Revolution in 1966. He launched the Cultural Revolution for many reasons. I think one of the reasons is that he's worried that China was becoming an elite country with bureaucrats only thinking of their own interests, and they had little regard for the interests and well-being of the ordinary people. So as a result, he mobilized the so-called Red Guards, mostly the high school students and university graduates, to attack government bureaucracies around the country, with the slogan, "Revolution is no crime, to rebel is justified." And also that as Mao exhorted the Red Guards to attack government bureaucracies around the country, he also started to promote outsiders to lead the government, just like what Donald Trump sort of did with his cabinets in his second term. In his second term, he packed his administration with all these very conservative and sort of part of his MAGA movement, aimed at so-called battling the Washington establishment and in the so-called, under the slogan, draining the swamp. The kind of cabinet picks that he has chosen is all very controversial, including his Secretary of Defense and Robert Kennedy Jr., for Health Secretary, and also the big tech critic, Brandon Carr, for heading the Federal Communications Commission. This kind of approach is sort of exactly what Mao Zedong did after launching the Cultural Revolution in 1966. Mm-hmm. He not only encouraged the Red Guards and the grassroots loyalists to take over the power at the central and local government levels across the country, and he started to promote the workers and the farmers who had little government experiences to run the government. For instance, Mao Zedong once trained Wang Xiangwei, previously a security guard and at a textile factory in Shanghai, as his successor. making him a deputy chairman of the Communist Party's Central Military Commission. And the party's Central Military Commission is the highest governing council of the military. A third resemblance, a third parallel is that after Mao launched the Cultural Revolution, he said it repeatedly, the enemies were not outsiders like the US or the Soviet Union. The enemies came from within. I think that's exactly what US Vice President J.D. Vance said
Yes, indeed.
at the Munich Security Conference not long ago, where he warned the EU about the enemies. And he said to the effect that the enemies were not China or Russia, but from within. So all this sort of give me and others of students of Chinese history a sort of very interesting, fruitful thought on to look at what is going on in the United States.
Yes, fantastic, Xiangwei, that you should draw this most interesting parallel with the Cultural Revolution. But of course, the Cultural Revolution lasted more than a decade. And hopefully, perhaps it's not for us to hope, but at least we're not quite sure how long this could last in the United States, perhaps 4 years. And if J.D. Vance were to succeed Trump, it could stay on for another 4 years, maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
But it does seem like a kind of purge, would you not say? And that too at the highest levels. It's something that you in China must have seen quite often, right?
Yes, absolutely. I think, again, we have to go back and talk about the Cultural Revolution. There was another reason Mao Zedong launched the Cultural Revolution was because he thought he was sort of lost control after another disastrous policy more introduced, the Great Leap Forward. The Chinese economy was in serious trouble. And then he will have to correct his policy. And then he thought he was losing power. That's why he launched the Cultural Revolution to get rid of the bureaucrats and senior officials who he believed were blocking his policies. And that's also the thing that we see happening in the United States, where I think Donald Trump is purging officials from all the major departments, including the military. And recently, he purged several generals in the military. He will probably have to leave the administration in less than 3 years, in 3 years' time. But I guess he wanted to complete transformation of the U.S. federal bureaucracy. He wanted to impose a permanent mark on how the U.S. government would be run. And then this kind of purge, as we can see from the China's Cultural Revolution, all those kind of purge and the attacks of the bureaucracy in the country had really plunged China into chaos for 10 years. And it took Deng Xiaoping several years to get things into order by launching the reform and opening up.
Mm-hmm. Do you think the same could happen with the United States, Xiangwei?
I hope. I don't know. It seems that, we are all outsiders, watching with intense interest of what is happening in the United States. And it seems to me every day there is a new development. And it seems that according to what I read, despite the kind of chaos that Trump has instigated, it seems to me he still enjoys very strong support among his power base. It is also because this is kind of a very strong reaction to what the sort of Democrats did over the past decade. And so, whether how long this will continue, whether the Democrats will get the Congress back in the midterm elections next year, I think we still have to wait and see.
Yes, of course. Yes,
how things will go.
that is true. Xiangwei, you must have been a very young man during the Cultural Revolution. Do you have any memories, direct memories of what it was like?
Actually, I was born in 1965, 1 year before the Cultural Revolution started. So from 1966 to 1976, I was barely 10 years old, but I still could feel the kind of craziness, the euphoria going on in China. I was born and grew up in a very industrial city in the northeastern part of China, but you could still feel it with the Red Guards chanting revolutionary slogans. I could also see the officials sort of being paraded on the streets. Even though I didn't know very much, but I could feel the euphoria. And it's also, maybe that's not something I should say it's in your podcast, is that everyone was sort of deeply affected. My name, Wang Xiangwei, in Chinese means Wang is my surname, Xiangwei means towards greatness. Mm-hmm. In fact, that was not my original name. My original name it's a different name. And then my father, swept in this euphoria, changed my original name to the current one, mm-hmm. to show the loyalty towards greatness, which means we address Mao as a great leader. So this is also his way of showing loyalty to the party. A lot of weird things happened during the Cultural Revolution.
Yes, indeed. And given the fact that you've done so well in the profession, Xiangwei, I think I must say he got your name quite right, Xiangwei.
Thank you. Yes. But I'm just using this as a kind of example to show
yes,
that lots of crazy things happened during the Cultural Revolution. Yes, later on, I quite like my name my father gave me.
It is a good one. But sitting here in Singapore and looking out towards your own country, Xiangwei, it looks like President Xi Jinping has been doing a bit of shuffling of the ranks himself. If you look at shuffles in the military, and most recently we heard about the technology minister who seems to have been switched out. Are there some sort of parallels that you see between these two countries and these two men who seem to have a certain fondness for each other, if I may say so?
Yeah, Ravi, that's a very good question. I think what is happening in China right now is what Xi Jinping is doing. Yeah, as you said earlier, that Trump has frequently openly admired Xi Jinping for being a very forceful and strong leader. But I think what Xi Jinping is doing in China right now is different from what Donald Trump is. In some way, there is some similarities, but then mostly what Xi Jinping is doing is different, because right now, ever since Xi Jinping came to power late 2012, over the past 10 years, Xi has tried to consolidate his power through tight controls and mostly through the anti-corruption campaign. I think what that is happening in China is this anti-corruption campaign is still in full swing, mm-hmm. is still going on. And I think however, as I said earlier, there is that something that China can learn from what sort of Donald Trump is doing in the United States. Right now, the Chinese officials and the state media are very happy to watch what is happening in the United States as Donald Trump and Musk wage the war against the U.S. federal bureaucracy. But I recently wrote something on this subject. I believe that the Chinese officials should be inspired to take a deeper look at China's own bloated and inefficient bureaucracies.
That was indeed a first-class column, Xiangwei. I really enjoyed that one.
Yeah.
But just to return to Donald Trump, the other big disruption seems to be foreign policy, and we just saw that big dust-up in the Oval Office just a few days ago between President Zelensky and President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance on the other side. From where you sit, what do you think have been the most remarkable foreign policy moves by Trump since coming to power?
Yeah, we are, I guess, like lots of people around the world, I'm deeply shocked at what transpires in that meeting. The fact that the whole drama was played live in front of the TV cameras. So my guess is that Trump and JD Vance deliberately allowed this to happen. And it was truly a shocking. But then, as I've been saying to many friends when we talk about this, is that I think right now, when we look at Donald Trump, we judge him by the values, by the common sense that we have. And then we see him doing things very unusual, shall I say. But then again, if you put yourself in his shoes, and then the picture will get clearer. Is that the US, and then you can have a better understanding of his policy of America first, that the US does not want to be the superpower to, as the world cop, to rule the world. Trump wants to do everything with this mantra, America first. So, which means from a China's point of view, that's why I have been arguing this in my articles, in my talks, that Trump's 2.0 may not be all the gloom and doom for China, because I think that's the sort of consensus among most of the China watchers. My view is a little bit contrary. So let me explain. First of all, geopolitically, I think what Donald Trump is doing is going to create greater chaos on the international stage. Like 10 years ago, the Chinese President Xi Jinping sort of first started to say that the whole world would face unprecedented challenges not seen in a century. At that time, I think some people will interpret his remark as a bit of a overly dramatic, but now it has turned out, he's right. Now we are entering into where now the whole world is facing unprecedented changes and seen in a century, as Xi Jinping said himself. And within that context, what I'm trying to say is this, that what Donald Trump is doing to China, Canada, EU, and others just showed that China could definitely benefit from what Donald Trump is doing. Basically, Joe Biden, in his 4 years, from China's point of view, he sort of succeeded in building up a united front in pushing back against China's influence. And he somehow made some progress in that. But now with the things that Donald Trump is doing, I think Trump has undone that united front, which is against China. So it will give, as I have argued repeatedly, that it will give China a good opportunity to mend ties with its major trading partners like EU, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and maybe even Canada.
Right.
I mean, because as you see, over the past 4 years, particularly during the COVID years, those 3 COVID years, I think China's ties with these major trading partners, the ones I mentioned earlier, were very strained for various reasons. China's ties with EU was strained because China's support for Russia after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And China's ties with Japan, South Korea, and Australia, UK were also strained. And now with this chaos Trump has introduced, I think it definitely gives China this good opportunity to amend ties.
Yes, there's a lot for us here in Singapore and in Southeast Asia to be worried about because of our close ties to the mainland economy. But Xiangwei, personality quirks aside, where do you see the US-China relationship heading ultimately? And some people believe that what Trump is doing in Europe is essentially to split the close coordination and the close relationship that has developed between China and Russia. Are you of that view? Do you agree with that?
There are some concerns among China watchers that as Donald Trump is going to end the war in Ukraine, and then as Washington is trying to improve ties with Moscow, and that will come as Beijing's expense. I think the concerns are valid, but I'm not unduly worried. I don't believe that Putin will burn the bridges with China because Washington is talking to Moscow. But the concern is definitely valid. I think what China needs to do on the international front, as I have said earlier, is to take advantage of U.S. withdrawal to improve its ties with these major trading partners. Mm-hmm. But I still believe that Beijing does not want to antagonize Washington too much, and neither Washington wants to antagonize Beijing too much. Mm-hmm. I think officially, if you read media reports, Beijing this morning reacted very strongly to the Trump's announcement of that the 20% tariff on China's exports to the United States will take into effect today. However, I do believe that Beijing and Washington, the officials from two countries, are meeting behind the scenes and trying to work out a deal.
I see.
On tariffs that both sides will find comfortable to bear with.
Right.
I think that is what is happening. And I hope, for the sake of mankind, I have been always the view that Beijing and Washington should work together. I think that right now they are talking. So my view here is also a bit of a contrarian, is that I believe in the next few months, or at least this year, the bilateral ties between Washington and Beijing will head for a period of relatively calmness. The reason being, as I have said earlier, they are trying to work out a deal. But then, having said that, the overall confrontation we are seeing right now between Beijing and Washington will continue until, I don't know when, until the day where there is a clear winner in this confrontation, which is that either China has overtaken the United States as the world's largest economy, or that the Washington wins and remains the lone superpower. Until we reach that equilibrium, I think the overall confrontation will continue. But then again, I think if you want to look at the China-US ties, I want to go back to a phrase I used in 2018 when Donald Trump launched the trade war against China. At that time, I said, and I still stick by that view, is that the bilateral ties between Beijing and Washington will be characterized by this 8-word phrase. In Chinese, it means 打打谈谈谈谈打打, which means the bilateral ties will be characterized by a period of fighting and followed by talks, and to be followed by fighting and to be followed by talks. So all in all,
I see.
Yeah.
So after the rain comes the dry period, you mean?
Yeah. It's in Chinese it's called 打打谈谈谈谈打打. Literal translation is fight, fight, talk, talk, fight, fight, talk, talk.
Xiangwei, that's been a most interesting conversation with you this morning, and there's so much to unpack from what you told us. Thank you so much for coming on Asian Insider.
Sure. Thank you for having me. I'll see you soon.
And that's a wrap for Asian Insider. I'm Ravi Velloor. This podcast was produced and edited by Faiz Hassani. Don't forget to share this podcast with your friends and family. If you'd like to read my articles, We have links in our podcast show notes below.
Send your feedback to podcast@sph.com.sg. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or within our Straits Times app. Thanks for listening.